Miami, 1985. Heat on the pavement, neon on the glass, and a crime clock that never slept. You could set your watch by the sirens. 3, sometimes 5 bank hits a week. Kidnappings folded into drug wars, and the kind of gunplay that made even veteran cops check their mirrors twice. Then, just when the city seemed numb to the noise, 2 ghosts stepped out of the glare and raised the stakes. They moved with military economy, carried long guns meant for war, and dressed like shadows. They didn't growl. They didn't grandstand. They arrived, struck, and evaporated. October 8th, 1985, just after lunch, an armored truck idled behind a stake and ale on South Dixie Highway. Routine pickup. The driver watched the rear view the way old boxers watch the bell. He never saw the pair until they were already there, paced and purposeful, a rifle and a shotgun drawing a hard line across the afternoon. The courier refused to surrender the vault on wheels, so the driver punched the accelerator and jolted out of harm's way, a steel whale thrashing out to sea. The intruders faded, tossing a military smoke grenade to curtain their retreat, the gray bloom swallowing the license plate and everything else. The call hit the FBI's Miami field office like a bad echo. Special Agent Gordon McNeil, commander of the Violent Crime Squad, rolled to the scene with the calm of a man who's counted shell casings in more parking lots than sunsets. Gloves, masks, no faces. Discipline. Buckshot here, .45 casings there. No fingerprints worth a prayer. No names. Just a feeling. These weren't thrill seekers. They were planners. 8 days later, the feeling came true. A Winn-Dixie supermarket. Another armored run. Same corridor of the city. Same ruthless choreography. The gunman with the shotgun barked the order. The report thundered, and the courier dropped. He'd fight for his life at the hospital. The assailants grabbed nothing and vanished again. Ballistics matched the first job. The .223 casings were cousins to the stake and ale fragments. Same rifle talking both times. New week, same predators, now willing to fire in broad daylight. It went that way for a while. The kind of while that ages investigators and makes witnesses forget faces. Within days, the duo tried Florida National Bank. Drive-through window. 10,000 in a guard satchel and a door that refused to cooperate. Abort. Flee. The downtown pulse never skipped. Later that afternoon, as if to prove a point, they struck Professional Savings Bank only blocks away. This time they were inside, black masks lowered like stage curtains. One rifle sweeping the lobby while the other scooped currency already warmed by the armored delivery. 41,000, give or take, vanished with the tail lights. The security cameras? Malfunction. Convenient. Infuriating. Not unusual for a city already sweating out the drug decade. Inside the bureau, the case lit a fuse. Miami agents trained harder, shot longer, and learned the edges of their own instincts. SWAT veterans shared range space with fresh suits whose only battlefield had been a grand jury room. The briefing board started to look like fever charts. Dates, times, angles, calibers. McNeil saw the pattern forming like heat shimmer on asphalt. The grid was small, South Dixie Highway and its feeder veins. Hits clustering within a few dozen blocks, most right after cash deliveries. Not luck. Surveillance. Whoever they were, they had the patience of hunters. January 10th, 1986. Barnett Bank. Another armored stop. The routine again. But routine is a thin thread in Miami. 2 figures emerged, faces buried under black fabric. Weapons carried low and steady. The guard went down. 3 shots on the ground, cold and quick. No theatrics, no wasted motion. The pair loaded up with 54,000 and peeled off. A man inside the bank, William Roberts, watched with the cool shock of a witness who refuses to blink. He tailed them at a safe distance, reading the city like a map he'd studied in another life. He caught the plate. He caught the model. He followed them into a lot where a white pickup sat waiting. Quick swap. The Monte Carlo was left cooling in the sun. Roberts flagged an officer, and the FBI got its first clean bite of data since the smoke grenade months earlier. The license came back to a family name, Briel. The agents drove to a modest residence and knocked with practiced caution. A mother opened the door. Worry lived behind her eyes. Her husband stood beside her, a man whose posture told you he'd tried to be brave for too long. Their son, Emilio, had borrowed the family car months earlier, said he was headed out to shoot targets near the Everglades, and he never came home. They'd filed a missing person report. They'd waited, and now the Bureau was at the door. Inside the living room, Special Agent Ed Morales, a quiet storm in a suit, asked gentle questions and listened for tremors in the answers. The Briels weren't conspirators. They were collateral, one more household press flat by a case with no names. The getaway car had never been reported stolen because it was supposed to be in their son's hands. The FBI conducted a careful examination and came up with nothing definitive. No prints they could ride to an arrest, no personal effects linking the unknown gunman to the Briel family. The Bureau left with empathy, uncertainty, and a renewed taste for the hunt. For weeks, the city entered the hush that follows a hurricane. The sun bright, the streets busy, but everyone stealing glances at the horizon. Agents rotated through the grid, chasing whispers and routines. McNeil's squad had a rule: follow the evidence, but don't ignore the gut. And one of the Bureau's best instincts wore a badge with 25 years baked into it. Special Agent Ben Grogan. The doctor, they called him because he could diagnose a case by touch. March 14th brought a clue dressed as a newspaper clipping. Grogan held it like a specimen on a slide. The article: a man named Jose Calazo had been ambushed at a lakeside shooting spot, pinned down by two strangers, pistol at one side, a Ruger Mini 14 at the other. They robbed him of his firearms, his wallet, and a black 1982 Chevy Monte Carlo. Then, believing the victim would never tell a soul, they fired into him and drove off in tandem. The stolen Monte Carlo in front, a white Ford F-150 pickup tucked behind like a shadow. Calazo did something the killers hadn't planned on. He crawled back on the water's edge and walked, wounded and determined, almost a mile until help appeared. Grogan's hunch snapped into focus. The Monte Carlo, the white pickup, both pieces fit the pattern the team had been sketching in pencil. If the duo felt untouchable, they would use that car again, maybe even plate, just to smirk at law enforcement. The FBI went to Calazo's hospital room, where antiseptic met adrenaline. He looked like he'd wrestled with fate, and won by an inch. Voice low, gaze steady. He described what he'd seen: build, age, the glint of steel blue revolver, the angles of the rifle. Details only a survivor clings to. A Metro-Dade artist drew composites from his words. The Bureau pinned the sketches high on the board where everyone could feel them looking back. The agents didn't wait for a break to land on the desk. They went hunting for trucks. McNeil ordered a grid check. Up and down South Dixie. Pull every white Ford F-150 license you can find between 88th Street and 185th. Old school work. Footwork. Clipboard patience. 10 plates came back. 10 sets of driver photographs were requested from the state. 10 chances to match a face to a sketch. The city, however, stayed restless. Before the DMV could answer with those faces, the pair returned to their stage. March 19th. Another bank. Another flash job. Everyone down. Rifles mapping the floor. 8,000 plus in the bag. The getaway car? As Grogan predicted, Calazo's Monte Carlo. Same tag. No disguise. A taunt across the airwaves. By now, even the most skeptical agents could feel the rhythm. Fridays, late mornings, always close to the armored deliveries, always within that tight rectangle of streets. Professional, rehearsed, not the chaos of amateurs, but the studied tempo of men who had trained for a different kind of war. And that reality sharpened the Bureau's resolve. If the city wouldn't blink, the FBI wouldn't either. April 10th. On the firing line, McNeil and Grogan traded notes between controlled bursts of muzzle flash. Enough waiting, they decided. You cannot just react to men like this. You have to invade their routine. So a plan took shape, simple, risky, necessary. Tomorrow, Friday, the violent crime squad would saturate the grid. 13, 14 agents. Plain sedans. Closed radios. Clear minds. They weren't going to wait for the next alarm. They were going to be there, eyes up, when the shadows moved. That's how you fight professionals, with better professionals. They weren't dressed for parade. They were dressed for the hunt. No SWAT helmets, no armored convoys. Just plain sedans, holstered steel, and the kind of tension that makes a man check his wristwatch twice without reading the time. Special Agent Gordon McNeil gave the briefing with clipped authority. He walked his squad through every robbery on the board, every pattern traced across South Dixie Highway. The plan was direct, spread across the grid, eyes sharp, radios open. If the gunmen moved today, the Bureau would be waiting. It wasn't just about catching thieves. It was about proving the Bureau could outthink ghosts. Among the agents stood Ben Grogan, gray at the temples, deliberate in his movements, the kind of veteran whose presence steadied the younger men. At his side was Jerry Dove, a sharp-eyed marksman barely a decade into his service. Eddie Morales, the quiet powerhouse, carried himself like a storm bottled in a suit. Each agent had read the files. Each had seen the photos of Collazo in his hospital bed. They knew what kind of adversaries they faced. Disciplined, ruthless, not afraid to squeeze the trigger first. By mid-morning, the squad cars rolled out, scattering into the veins of the city. The agents cruised the avenues near the usual targets, banks, shopping centers, parking lots where armored trucks made their routine stops. Radios clicked with small updates. Nothing on Kendall. Clear on 152nd. All quiet near the Winn-Dixie. Hours passed, the Florida sun heating windshields, the monotony broken only by that constant electric expectation. At 9:30 a.m., one voice cracked through the static. Unit 3 possible sighting. The description matched. A black Monte Carlo, tinted, moving deliberate down South Dixie. The plate was too familiar. Collazo's car, still brazenly in play. The agent's tail with surgical caution. Grogan and Dove slid into shadow of the vehicle, careful not to spook it. Morales kept parallel, eyes darting between mirrors and corners. McNeil, monitoring from another lane, instructed restraint. No premature stop. Not until they knew for certain what the suspects had in mind. The Monte Carlo was heading toward the banking district, the same square where the predators had fed before. 10 o'clock came, then 11. The Monte Carlo circled, unhurried, almost casual. Then it slipped into the lot of the bank on South Dixie Highway. Two men emerged, faces cold, movements precise. One carried a Mini 14 rifle, the other a shotgun. Masks weren't yet drawn, but their intent was clear as daylight. The agents exchanged terse confirmations over the radio. This was it. The routine had arrived, right on schedule. The Bureau watched as the gunmen moved with purpose toward the armored truck, making its delivery. Civilians were close, bank customers, clerks at the door. To strike here was to risk lives in every direction. McNeil's voice was steady as he made the call. Follow, but don't pounce. Let them move. Let them commit. Then we'll box them in. Minutes later, the Monte Carlo pulled away, cash-laden and quick, weaving into traffic like any other morning driver. The convoy of Bureau vehicles fanned out, stalking the rear bumper with unblinking patience. Radio stayed hot. Northbound, US 1. Monte Carlo accelerating. All units close in. The streets grew tighter, the chase pressing into the veins of suburban Miami. Agents adjusted, trying to pin the suspects without igniting chaos among commuters. Every mirror glance carried the same silent question. When do we make the move? Grogan, calm as always, murmured into the radio, "Patience, gentlemen. They'll give us an opening." And they did. The Monte Carlo rolled into a residential neighborhood. Quiet streets, trimmed lawns, children's bicycles leaning on chain-link fences. Here, far from the noise of Dixie Highway. The killers thought they could vanish. Instead, the Bureau tightened the net. Engines growled low as agents prepared for the decisive block. It was no longer a question of if, but how fast the storm would break. Because once the Monte Carlo stopped, it would not be a surrender. It would be war. The Monte Carlo cut through the neighborhood like a shark in shallow water. Houses on both sides, driveways dotted with family cars, blinds half open as residents went about their morning. But behind the tinted glass of that Chevy sat two men who had already tasted blood and would not hesitate to spill more. Special Agent Gordon McNeil steadied his breathing. He'd commanded high-risk arrests before, but this was different. These weren't stick-up kids with Saturday night pistols. These were predators armed with military firepower. The Bureau had prepared for this moment. Yet every man knew, once the trap snapped shut, nothing would unfold by the book. The order came across the radio like a drumbeat. Move in. Grogan and Dove accelerated from the rear. Morales from the flank. McNeil bearing down from the front. Civilian traffic thinned. The streets narrowing into a stage set for confrontation. In seconds, Bureau sedans boxed a Monte Carlo in. Fenders pressing tight. Engines straining as tires screamed against asphalt. The suspects reacted instantly. Discipline carved into every gesture. Doors flew open. The driver lunged out, Mini, 14 rifle braced. The passenger rolled with a shotgun already at his shoulder. It wasn't panic. It was trained, deliberate violence. Gunfire cracked the morning silence. The first burst tore into Bureau windshields, glass raining across dashboards. McNeil's sedan jolted with impacts, rounds chewing through metal. He felt the sting of fragments slice his hand, but forced the door open, weapon in grip. He crouched low, advancing with controlled steps. Grogan and Dove ducked behind their car, trading measured shots. Grogan, steady as stone despite his years, leaned just far enough to sight the rifleman. Dove, younger, quicker, mirrored him, covering the angles. Across the street, Morales spilled from his vehicle, sliding into cover with the instinct of a street fighter. Neighbors screamed from porches. Children were dragged inside. The neighborhood that had been serene minutes earlier now echoed with the percussion of war. McNeil shouted commands, voice cutting through the chaos, urging civilians back, urging his squad forward. But the suspects pressed hard, their Mini 14 spitting high-velocity rounds faster than the agents could counter. A sedan door splintered under barrage. An FBI tire blew out in a hiss of rubber. Grogan advanced, cautious and determined, his revolver steady despite bullets shattering brick beside him. Dove flanked, seeking an opening, pressing closer than safety allowed. Morales moved with raw aggression, closing distance, willing to risk everything to break the killer's rhythm. This wasn't an arrest anymore. This was survival. Each man knew. The Bureau's mission was more than taking suspects into custody. It was to end the rampage here and now, before another guard bled out on a sidewalk, before another family stared at an empty chair. The Monte Carlo's occupants understood it too. They fired not to escape, but to kill. And so, under the blinding Florida sun, with the scent of gunpowder thick in the breeze, the quiet suburban street became a battlefield. The trap had sprung. Now the outcome would hinge on grit, timing, and the unflinching will of the FBI. The gunfight raged in waves, short bursts of fire, followed by tense pauses where even the palm fronds seemed to hold their breath. Every pause carried the weight of a trigger half pulled, of predators gauging their next strike. Special Agent Gordon McNeil crouched low, blood slick across his hand, revolver raised. He had been hit, but pain was a luxury he couldn't afford. From his angle, he caught fleeting glimpses of the rifleman, hard eyes, steady aim, moving with the rhythm of a soldier. McNeil squeezed off shots, forcing the man back behind the Monte Carlo steel. Across the way, Ben Grogan and Jerry Dove advanced methodically, covering each other like dancers rehearsed in a deadly routine. Grogan, calm, deliberate, moved inches at a time, revolver steady. Dove, quicker, younger, pressed the gap, fired with precision, never wasting a round. Together they created a rhythm, a push and pull that kept the suspects from dictating the tempo. But the rifle spat back with relentless fury. One burst caught Grogan's glasses, shattering them into shards. He blinked through the distortion, refusing to yield ground. Dove dropped lower, lips tight, aiming through smoke and chaos. They had trained for this, but no training fully prepared a man for .223 rounds chewing through car doors at 40 yards. Eddie Morales was the storm, charging forward despite shrapnel burning his arm. He returned fire with the fury of a man unwilling to lose his city to killers. He closed distance faster than logic advised, every step punctuated by muzzle flashes around him. At one point, a round tore into his forearm, dropping his gun. He switched hands without hesitation, picked it back up, and pressed on undeterred. Neighbors peeked from curtains. Prayers whispered as bullet casings clinked against pavement. A child cried from inside a house where a window had shattered, glass raining into the living room. The ordinary street had transformed into a war zone, and still the duel dragged on. The suspects maneuvered with practiced precision, covering each other, conserving ammunition, never firing wild. They weren't running. They were holding their ground. To them, escape wasn't necessary if they could simply annihilate the Bureau's line. But the agents, outgunned, outarmored, had resolve that outlasted any rifle magazine. Every breath was discipline. Every movement calculated to close the noose a fraction tighter. Grogan steadied himself behind a Buick. Exhaling before another shot, Dove crept forward, narrowing the angle, forcing the gunman into tighter cover. McNeil, wounded, still barked instructions, voice iron over pain. Morales, bleeding, relentless, kept drawing fire to himself, daring the shooters to break concentration. For 15 minutes the firefight carved its fury into the block. By then, every man knew this wasn't a standoff that could stretch into hours. Something would give. Someone would fall. And on that suburban street, under the Florida sun, it was about to become heartbreakingly clear who would pay the price. The air grew thick with cordite. Sunlight fractured through drifting smoke. Agents fired measured rounds. Each shot meant to carve an opening in the suspect's relentless defense. But the rifleman, cool as stone, shifted his aim with merciless precision. Ben Grogan leaned from cover, revolver firm in his grasp. The veteran, who had trained generations of agents, moved steady despite his shattered glasses. He pressed forward, heart anchored to duty. Then, a sharp report. A bullet found him. Grogan fell, the weight of decades of service collapsing onto the pavement. His weapon slipped from his hand. The street, suddenly quieter in his absence. Jerry Dove, his partner at that moment, surged closer, youth in his stride, determination burning hotter than fear. He returned fire, eyes locked on the rifleman. He fought like a man who believed momentum could turn the tide. But the predator's aim held true. Another burst, another impact. Dove staggered, then fell beside Grogan. 2 lives extinguished within breaths. 2 of the Bureau's finest cut down before the fight had ended. Across the street, Gordon McNeil felt the loss like a knife. Wounded himself, blood pulsing through his sleeve, he bit down the grief. His men were down, but the Bureau's line would not break. He fired back, pressing rounds into the Monte Carlo shadow, refusing to surrender the field. Eddie Morales, wounded yet unyielding, felt the battle shift. His arm throbbed, his body screamed for pause, but he only advanced. Each step carried him closer to killers, closer to the heart of the storm. He knew the price already paid. He knew what had to be done. The neighborhood had fallen silent beyond the gunfire. Civilians cowered behind locked doors, hearing the thunder of a war not their own. Sirens wailed faint in the distance, reinforcements racing, but seconds stretched like miles. For now, it was these few agents alone against trained killers. Grogan and Dove lay still, their sacrifice staining the ground. McNeil steadied his revolver. Morales pressed forward, and the suspects still spat fire, convinced they could outlast the Bureau. But the FBI does not retreat. Not here, not in this neighborhood, not under the sun. The gunmen had drawn blood, but the fight was far from finished. The street had become sacred ground, and the Bureau's surviving men would carry the battle to its bitter end. The firefight narrowed to its final breaths. Magazines nearly dry, revolvers hot to the touch. The suspects, believing victory within reach, pressed their rifles hard against the Bureau's thinning line. But the surviving agents, bloodied, battered, unbroken, tightened their resolve. Special Agent Gordon McNeil, wounded and weak, steadied himself behind shattered metal. His revolver barked defiance, every shot buying seconds for his comrades. He knew the fight wasn't just for survival. It was for Grogan and Dove, who lay fallen mere yards away. Their sacrifice demanded the Bureau's line hold, no matter the cost. Eddie Morales was a storm that would not die. His left arm hung heavy, torn by bullets, yet he fought on with his right. He surged forward with the fury of a man who had already accepted the price of duty. Crawling closer, gun blazing, Morales turned raw pain into momentum. At last, the moment broke. The suspects, rattled by the FBI's unrelenting push, tried to seize new cover, repositioning around the Monte Carlo. It was the opening Morales needed. With a roar, he closed the gap, unleashing round after round at point-blank range. The rifleman staggered. The passenger collapsed. The threat, finally, was neutralized. Silence fell heavy, punctured only by the ringing in every survivor's ears. Smoke drifted across lawns. The Monte Carlo sat riddled with holes, its menace extinguished. Neighbors crept from their homes, faces pale, eyes wide. They had witnessed a war erupt on their street, a war fought not in a jungle or desert, but in the quiet of suburban Miami. And at its center, FBI agents who had refused to yield. Grogan and Dove would not rise. Their loss tore a hole in the Bureau's heart, a reminder that bravery is often written in blood. Yet their stand and the sacrifice etched into that asphalt became legend. The Bureau studied every second of that morning, the tactics, the weapons, the mistakes. Training across the nation changed because of Miami. Agents would be equipped with greater firepower, heavier armor, new doctrine forged from the crucible of that fight. But the legacy was more than tactics. It was courage, Grogan's steady advance, Dove's fearless drive, McNeil's grit despite wounds, Morales' final charge. Their story became a cornerstone, a grim reminder that the FBI's work is carried not only by skill and strategy, but by the will to face danger when others cannot. April 11, 1986. A date written in Bureau history. A day when a neighborhood became a battlefield, when two masked marauders met the unyielding wall of the FBI and discovered that though they could wound, though they could kill, they could never truly defeat. Because in the end, the Bureau rose from that bloodied street stronger, sharper, and forever bound to the sacrifice of those who fell in Miami.